Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the surprisingly unwashed world of old Europe, a time when skipping a bath for weeks, or even months, wasn't unusual at all. Back then, personal hygiene followed rules very different from ours, shaped by superstition, limited resources, and some rather questionable medical advice. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see where our audience comes from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you think going a couple of days without showering is bad, imagine it being the norm, and nobody even blinking an eye. Close your eyes. Let the noise of the modern world fade into the background. Imagine a different time, where the streets were made of stone and lit only by flickering torches. The air was thick with wood smoke, the scent of livestock, and the quiet hush of a world moving at the pace of footsteps and hooves. This is medieval Europe, a land of castles, famine, kings, and silence. And in this world, something we take for granted today was strangely missing: regular bathing. It may seem unbelievable now, but for much of medieval Europe, going months without a proper bath wasn't just common, it was normal. People wore the same clothes for weeks, rarely washed their hair, and considered a full-body bath to be something of an event. You might ask, how could they live like that? Weren't they disgusted? Didn't they smell awful? Weren't they afraid of getting sick? The answer to those questions is hidden in a fascinating web of belief systems, lost infrastructure, cultural shifts, and survival instincts. And to truly understand it, we need to go back in time, not just to the Middle Ages, but even further, to a civilization where bathing was not only common, but sacred. Long before medieval Europe, the Roman Empire was flourishing, and the Romans loved to bathe. Their cities were filled with grand public bathhouses, with heated floors, marble columns, and warm pools where people would soak, scrub, and socialize. Bathing wasn't just about hygiene. It was a ritual, a social event, and a sign of being civilized. Roman engineers built aqueducts to carry fresh water across mountains and valleys, feeding fountains, latrines, and, of course, the great baths. But when Rome fell, much of that brilliance fell with it. The aqueducts crumbled, the plumbing rusted, and the public baths, once symbols of order and health, became ruins. Europe fragmented into small kingdoms and warring factions, and survival replaced luxury. The art of bathing in many places was simply lost. But there was more to the story than just broken pipes. As the Roman way of life faded, a new worldview was rising, one shaped by the growing power of the Church. Christianity brought with it a deep reverence for the soul and a wary view of the body. Many religious leaders of the time viewed bathing, especially communal bathing, as suspicious, even sinful. The idea of being naked with others was tied to temptation and immorality. Cleanliness of the flesh was seen as far less important than purity of the spirit. Some monks and theologians even warned that bathing too often could weaken the body or invite disease through open pores. Water, they believed, could make you vulnerable, physically and morally. So public bathhouses, once centers of daily life, were shut down or repurposed. In some places they became dens of vice, further reinforcing their negative image. A clean body, it seemed, was no longer a sign of holiness. It was a sign of indulgence. Without public baths, and without plumbing, people adapted to a new rhythm of cleanliness. Washing became a quick rinse from a bucket or a wipe with a damp cloth. Immersion in warm water was rare and often reserved for the sick or the very wealthy. Most people didn't own tubs or even have private rooms where they could bathe.
Water had to be fetched by hand, heated over a fire, and poured into wooden barrels that leaked and rotted with time. Linen was the secret weapon of the Middle Ages. People wore undergarments made of linen and changed them more often than outer clothes. The linen absorbed sweat and oil from the body, and by changing it, they believed they were keeping themselves clean. Herbs, flowers, and scented oils were also used to mask body odors, especially by nobles and courtiers who couldn't risk being perceived as offensive. In this world, the modern idea of a bad smell didn't really exist the way it does now. When everyone carried the same earthy scent, it wasn't strange. It was normal. And in fact, those who smelled strongly of perfume were sometimes viewed with suspicion. The human nose adjusts quickly, and for medieval people their own scent was invisible. So why didn't people in medieval Europe bathe for months? It wasn't laziness. It wasn't ignorance. It was a mixture of lost infrastructure, spiritual philosophy, fear of disease, and sheer practicality. Their world was colder, harder, and slower. And within that world, they made choices that to them felt perfectly rational. As you drift off tonight, think about the strangeness of time, how something as simple as a bath could carry such different meanings across the centuries. Cleanliness is not just about water and soap. It's about what a culture values, fears, and believes. The flickering torchlight of medieval Europe casts long shadows not just on the streets and stone walls, but on the way people understood the world itself. Medicine in those days was not what we know today. There were no microscopes, no antibiotics, no concept of germs. Illness was something mysterious, invisible, and deeply feared. And so, when people avoided bathing, it wasn't just because of modesty or the collapse of infrastructure. It was because they truly believed it might make them sick. To understand their thinking, we must step into the world of medieval medicine. At the heart of it was a theory called humorism, passed down from ancient Greece and Rome. According to this theory, the human body was governed by 4 fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was believed to be a delicate balance between these humors. If one became dominant or corrupted, illness would follow. This balance wasn't just physical. It was connected to emotions, personality, and even the seasons. Blood was warm and moist, tied to cheerfulness and spring. Black bile was cold and dry, linked to melancholy and autumn. Physicians believed that the body reacted to changes in the environment, food, and even mood. Warm weather could make the blood too hot. Too much sadness could disturb the balance. And most importantly, exposure to water, especially warm water, was seen as risky. When a person bathed, especially in a hot bath, it was believed that the pores of the skin would open wide, making the body more vulnerable to outside influences. Air, they believed, could carry invisible poisons, and once the skin was open, these miasmas could enter and cause disease. This idea, known as miasma theory, was accepted across Europe. People feared bad air, particularly air that lingered around swamps, the sick, or even freshly stirred earth. A warm bath, then, was a dangerous thing. It could weaken the body's defenses. Doctors often advised that after bathing one should rest, avoid cold drafts, and stay indoors. For many, it seemed safer to skip the bath entirely. This belief was especially strong during outbreaks of disease. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing millions, people looked for anything that might explain it. Some blamed the stars, others blamed sin. But many believed that bathing had opened their bodies to poisonous air. As a result, public baths, which had still existed in some towns, were shut down. Even private bathing became rare. Those who could afford it hired physicians to balance their humors through other means, bleeding, purging, or adjusting diet. Cleanliness of the skin was not a medical goal. Instead, health was thought to come from harmony within. A clean body on the outside was meaningless if the inside was diseased. Even so, not everyone gave up bathing completely. In some cities, especially in southern Europe, public bathhouses survived a little longer. In parts of Italy, Spain, and even southern France, where the influence of the old Roman ways still lingered, people continued to wash more frequently than their northern neighbors. But they too were affected by the growing suspicion of water. Among the wealthy, bathing shifted from a public activity to a private one. Nobles might bathe in wooden tubs lined with linens, surrounded by perfumes, herbs, and attendants. But even then, it was not a weekly event. It was rare, reserved for special occasions, illness, or preparation for a long journey. For the poor, even this was a luxury out of reach. Yet in all of this, it's important to remember that people did care about their health. They were not careless or ignorant. They followed the best medical advice available to them at the time. And if that advice told them that warm water could bring fever, or that open pores could invite death, then avoiding the bath was not laziness. It was caution. Imagine living in a world where every illness was a mystery, where pain was explained by imbalance, and prevention meant staying dry, covering your body, and avoiding strange smells in the air. A bath might feel good, but if it could lead to death, was it worth the risk? As you lie back and imagine these distant lives, know that their choices were shaped by fear, wisdom, and survival. What we now see as backwards, they saw as reasonable. And perhaps, hundreds of years from now, people may look back at some of our beliefs and wonder the same. Inside a modest medieval home, life unfolded in a single dim room shared by everyone, parents, children, and even animals during colder months. The floor was usually packed earth, sometimes covered in straw or rushes. Walls were made of timber or rough stone, and the windows, if there were any, were small and unglazed, letting in only slivers of light. The air was thick with the smell of firewood, dampness, and the mixture of life lived close together. In this space, cleanliness was not about removing germs, a concept that didn't exist yet. It was about comfort, habit, and managing the natural realities of a world without plumbing. People washed themselves not with baths, but with bowls and cloths. A basin of water, reused by several members of the household, would be placed near the hearth or in a corner. A cloth would be dipped and wrung, then rubbed over the face, neck, hands, and sometimes underarms. Hair might be combed with scented oil or left alone for days. Washing was not a ritual of purity. It was simply maintenance, like sweeping the floor. Water itself was not always trusted. In towns, it often came from wells or rivers that also carried waste. In cities, human and animal waste was thrown into the streets, and the same waterways used for drinking might also serve tanners or butchers upstream. This meant that even if one wanted to wash, finding clean water was not always possible. Collecting, heating, and transporting it required time, effort, and fuel, resources many peasants could not spare. Instead of washing their bodies, people focused on their linens. Linen shirts, chemises, and undergarments were worn close to the skin and changed more frequently than outer clothing. These linens were carefully laundered, boiled if possible, then hung to dry in open air. The belief was that the linen absorbed the dirt and sweat from the skin, so changing and cleaning it was considered a form of personal hygiene. A person might wear the same wool tunic or dress for weeks, but the linen beneath would be changed as often as their circumstances allowed. Smell was ever present, and people learned to live with it. Herbs were tucked into clothing, lavender, rosemary, mint, to offer small bursts of freshness. Perfumed oils, if one could afford them, might be applied to the wrists or neck. In homes with a fireplace, smoke acted as a kind of deodorizer, seeping into fabric and skin. This smoky layer became part of the scent of daily life. People did not expect to smell clean. They expected to smell human. Personal grooming was still important. Combs were common, often made of wood or bone, and were used to manage lice as much as style. Delousing was a regular task, and people were unbothered by its necessity. Fingernails were trimmed with small knives. Teeth were wiped with cloth or rinsed with water and wine. Some chewed herbs or twigs to freshen the breath. There was a quiet dignity to this care, practical, unhurried, and adapted to a different understanding of health. Bathing, when it did occur, was an occasion. A tub might be brought into the home, wooden, round, and deep enough to sit in. Water would be carried in heavy buckets from the well, heated over a fire, and poured in slowly. The head of the household might bathe first, followed by the rest, in the same water. Scented herbs like chamomile or sage were sometimes added to the bath, not for cleansing, but for relaxation or minor healing. The process could take hours and was rarely repeated more than a few times a year. In wealthier households, servants prepared baths, carried water, and washed the clothes. The wealthy might own their own copper tubs, and they had access to perfumes, soaps made with animal fats and ash and scented powders. But even among the elite, frequent full-body bathing was unusual. The concern about illness from open pores lingered, and many chose instead to wash discreetly and often invisibly. Cleanliness was shaped by season and class. In winter, washing declined due to the cold and the danger of catching a chill. In summer, people washed slightly more, though still with restraint. During the feast days or religious festivals, extra attention might be given to grooming. Clothes scrubbed, faces washed, hair combed neatly. But always, the priority was modesty, necessity, and balance. No one believed they were dirty. They believed they were living properly. They feared excess as much as they feared filth. Water was not a symbol of purity, but of risk, labor, and mystery. And so, with quiet hands and a daily rhythm, they stayed clean in ways that had little to do with soap and water. Life in medieval Europe was built around repetition and rhythm. The passing of time was not marked by clocks, but by the tolling of church bells, the shifting of seasons, and the demands of the land. With each dawn, people woke to the familiar rituals of survival. Fetching water, tending animals, preparing food, mending what had worn down. Within this world, the concept of hygiene was woven quietly into everyday labor. Water, though essential, was always a burden. In towns and villages, it had to be fetched daily from wells, streams, or communal fountains. The buckets were heavy, and the journey often long. In winter, the water froze. In summer, it evaporated quickly. Once home, the water had to be used wisely, reserved for drinking, cooking, and occasionally for washing. Even when people wanted to be clean, the effort and cost made it difficult. Soap, as we know it today, was rare and expensive. Simple soaps did exist, made from ash, lard, and herbs, but their use was limited. They were harsh on the skin and mostly reserved for laundry or the wealthier classes. Most people cleaned themselves with water alone, or by rubbing with rough cloths or sand to scrub away surface grime. The scent of sweat, earth, and fire became the natural background of life. Despite all of this, there was a quiet awareness of the need to care for one's body. In many homes, especially during spring and summer, there were small routines for washing feet at night, wiping the face in the morning, and combing the hair regularly. Feet, in particular, were a focus, since people walked everywhere, often barefoot or in crude leather shoes. A basin by the hearth would be used to soak and scrub away the dust of the road before sleep. Women often cared for their family's hygiene. Mothers washed their children's hands and faces, combed their hair, and checked for signs of illness. Older daughters helped maintain the linen, shaking out the dust, boiling garments over fires, and laying them to dry in the sun. This labor was unseen but constant, an act of devotion more than vanity. Cleanliness also had a spiritual dimension. Though bathing the body was not emphasized, cleansing the soul was. Pilgrims walked for weeks to visit holy sites. Confession and penance were regular practices. Water was used symbolically in baptism, washing away sin rather than sweat. And during major holy days, people might wash their faces or hands in preparation, not for health, but as a sign of humility and reverence. Monasteries were places where habits of cleanliness were slightly more preserved. Monks and nuns lived in disciplined routines that sometimes included regular washing, especially of hands before meals and feet on certain feast days. Monastic rules, like those written by Saint Benedict, encouraged moderation in all things, including hygiene. While full baths were infrequent, cleanliness was still seen as a form of order, reflecting the purity of spiritual life. In cities, attitudes began to vary. Urban centers grew crowded, and waste management became a pressing concern. Regulations were introduced to limit where waste could be thrown, and some towns built bathhouses that offered private or shared rooms, heated water, and massage. But these were not found everywhere, and many disappeared during times of plague or war. Still, in the corners of European towns, bathing culture did not die completely. It simply shifted shape. The nobility lived with a different rhythm. In their castles and manor houses, there was more space, more water, more fabric, and more time. Servants helped with washing. Clothes were made of finer materials. Baths, when they occurred, were more ceremonial, perfumed, softened with petals or milk, and often accompanied by music or food. Yet even among the upper classes, the belief persisted that too much bathing weakened the body. It was best done sparingly and always followed by rest. Hygiene, then, was never absent from medieval life. It was simply practiced according to the realities of the time. Cleanliness meant something different. It meant being proper, modest, and in harmony with the seasons. It meant not offending others, not attracting attention, and not wasting what was precious. The body was part of the world, and caring for it meant learning how to live within that world wisely. In this quiet rhythm of survival, the people of medieval Europe moved through their days, neither filthy nor spotless, but simply human, carrying the dust of the road, the smoke of the fire, and the scent of a life lived close to the earth. As twilight settled over the countryside, the small flickers of hearth fires glowed through wooden shutters and stone walls. In these quiet hours, families gathered close, not just for warmth, but for protection against the unknown. Darkness was more than the absence of light. It was a time of uncertainty, when spirits, illness, and bad air were thought to roam freely. Within this world of superstition and limited knowledge, beliefs about the body and its relationship to the outside world played a powerful role in how people approached cleanliness. The idea that water could heal was not foreign, but it was often overshadowed by the fear that water, especially when warm, could weaken the body or even open it to evil influences. This fear was rooted not only in religious thinking but also in the teachings of the earliest physicians, who passed their knowledge from monastery to university, blending Greek philosophy with Christian doctrine. The body was seen as porous, delicate, easily influenced by heat, cold, and especially moisture. When someone fell ill, it was common to avoid bathing altogether. The sick were kept warm and dry, wrapped in layers of cloth and confined to their beds. Doctors might recommend bloodletting, changes in diet, or herbal poultices, but rarely would they suggest a bath. In fact, exposure to water was often discouraged, especially in times of epidemic. If a person began to sweat, it was seen as a sign that the body was purging itself of harmful humors. To wash off that sweat, it was thought, could interrupt healing or even invite death. This fear extended beyond the sick. Many people avoided washing during colder months, believing that the shock of cold water or the lingering dampness it left behind could bring on a fever or chill. Clothing was layered thickly, and even if it was heavy with use, it provided warmth and protection. A fresh linen undershirt might be enough to signal renewal without ever touching water to the skin. Despite this, public bathhouses did exist in many towns and cities, particularly before the major plagues began to shift social habits. These bathhouses were places of warmth and rest, often divided by gender or by time of day. Some were simple, rooms with large wooden tubs and steam rising from heated stones. Others were more elaborate, with multiple chambers, attendants, and offerings of oils or wine. They were places where one could sit, soak, and allow the warmth to ease the body's stiffness from labor or travel. But even in these spaces, caution lingered. Patrons were advised not to stay too long, not to bathe on an empty stomach, and to dry quickly before leaving. It was understood that the body was vulnerable after bathing, and it was best to return home immediately, wrap oneself in dry garments, and rest. Bathing was seen not as part of a daily routine, but as an occasional event, restorative if done carefully, dangerous if done wrong. Over time, bathhouses began to attract a different reputation. In some places, they became associated with illicit behavior, particularly as they grew in popularity among the wealthy and the bored. Some towns passed laws to limit their use or to separate the sexes more strictly. In others, religious leaders preached against them entirely, calling them places of vanity and temptation. Slowly, the image of the bathhouse darkened, and many were closed or abandoned, especially during outbreaks of disease. Yet among the people, memory lingered. In regions with warmer climates and where Roman influence had been stronger, the habit of bathing persisted longer. In southern France, Italy, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula, the bath was still seen as a source of comfort. There, small private baths continued quietly behind garden walls and villa courtyards, hidden from suspicion. Across the continent, habits were shaped not just by belief, but by geography. In mountainous villages with clean, flowing streams, people might bathe more frequently, especially in summer. In swampy regions where water was feared and disease more common, washing was more restrained. In port cities with foreign travelers, new ideas sometimes arrived, challenging local norms. But even then, change was slow, and old ways held fast. Cleanliness in medieval Europe was never simple. It was shaped by caution, class, custom, and climate. And within each household, each town, each corner of the continent, different rules quietly governed when and how a person might cleanse their body. In the silence of the medieval countryside, the sounds of water were both familiar and sacred. The distant gurgle of a stream, the soft drip from a moss-covered roof, the creak of a wooden pail dipping into a well. Each sound carried meaning. Water was life, but it was also effort. It was pulled from the earth with hands that were already tired, carried across uneven ground, and poured carefully, every drop accounted for. In this world, where water required labor, bathing was never casual. The idea of plunging into water simply for the pleasure of it would have felt strange to most. Instead, water was measured, rationed, and used with purpose. A small basin might serve an entire family. The act of washing a face or rinsing hands became part of the morning and evening rhythm, a quiet moment of focus before or after a long day. Children were taught early to wipe their faces, clean their feet, and not waste what was precious. Rainwater, when collected, offered one of the cleanest sources of washing water. Wooden barrels or stone cisterns stood beneath sloped roofs, capturing the runoff from storms. This water was softer than that of rivers or wells, and it was prized for washing hair or soaking linens. But even then, it was used sparingly. No one knew when the next good rain might come, or how long the stored supply would last. To soak the entire body in rainwater was a luxury few could justify. Clothing, more than the skin beneath it, became the target of cleanliness. A person might wear the same outer garments for weeks, but their undergarments, usually made of linen, were changed and cleaned more regularly. The process of laundering was physically demanding. Clothes were soaked, scrubbed against boards or stones, boiled in large pots with ashes or soap root, then wrung out and hung to dry in open air. This work took an entire day, and for large families it was done in cycles, piece by piece. In rural areas, washing clothes often meant a trip to the river. Women knelt at the banks, sleeves rolled up, voices low as they worked side by side. Water slapped against fabric, stones rubbed against stains. Cold crept into hands and feet, even in summer. These moments, though laborious, were also a kind of quiet gathering, a rare space for conversation, laughter, and the sharing of stories. Hair care followed its own rhythm. Most people did not wash their hair often with water, especially in colder seasons. Instead, they combed it thoroughly each day using bone or wooden combs. Some dusted their scalps with fine powder made from crushed herbs or clay to absorb oils. Hair was braided, wrapped, or covered, depending on social status and local custom. For women, long hair was often considered a symbol of virtue, and it was rarely cut. Men wore their hair in varying styles, some cropped short, others left shoulder length and wild. In noble households, grooming became more elaborate. Ladies used perfumed waters to freshen their skin. Gentle powders were applied to faces to soften the appearance. Hair was scented with rose oil or lavender, and occasionally tinted with herbs or even metals to match the fashions of court. Attendants brushed and styled each strand with care. Yet even in these luxurious spaces, bathing was done with caution. A lady might bathe only a few times a year, with servants preparing everything in advance. The water heated over fires, the tub lined with cloth, and the room sealed against drafts. Among men of rank, especially knights or officials, washing might follow battle, travel, or public appearance. Armor was heavy and suffocating, and after days in the field, even a cautious bath felt necessary. But it remained a rare occasion, often followed by rest, warm wine, and layers of wool to guard the body from chills. Cleanliness was never rushed. It was slow, deliberate, and watched carefully. Throughout society, ideas about health were deeply tied to the visible signs of order. A person with neat hair, clean linen, and well-kept shoes was considered respectable, even if they had not bathed in months. Dirt under the nails or a foul smell might suggest poverty or carelessness, but it was not unusual. People understood that labor left marks. A farmer smelled of earth, a blacksmith of smoke and iron, a baker of flower and fire. These scents were not offensive. They were part of a person's story. Cleanliness in this world was not the absence of scent or dirt, but the presence of care. A carefully mended tunic, a combed beard, a child's face wiped clean with a mother's sleeve. These small acts held meaning. They reflected a person's place in the world, their pride, and their discipline. The rhythm of the seasons guided nearly every part of medieval life, and with them came quiet changes in how people approached cleanliness. Spring brought renewal, not just to the fields and trees, but to the body and home. After months of cold and darkness, when water froze in barrels and mud coated everything, people welcomed the return of warmth with small acts of cleansing. Linen was soaked in streams, walls were scrubbed, tools were cleaned, and the scent of herbs returned to homes through bundles hung from beams and windows. In many villages, May Day and the coming of summer marked more than just celebration. It was also the time for what some called the Great Washing. People took to the rivers or shallow lakes, washing themselves with a care that had been postponed for months. Children splashed while mothers scrubbed their arms. Men rinsed sweat from their faces, shoulders, and necks. No one spoke of it as a ritual, but it felt that way, almost sacred in its simplicity. By contrast, winter brought restraint. The fire became the center of life, and water was precious beyond words. To wash meant braving the cold, possibly falling ill. So people layered up instead. Wool, linen, and fur were worn in thick combinations. Cloaks were brushed clean with stiff brushes, not washed. Boots were scraped, but rarely soaked. Families huddled together, conserving warmth, conserving energy, and learning to live with the smell of smoke, sweat, and cooked broth. Smell itself carried a different meaning in the medieval world. People were surrounded by scents, most of them natural and few of them judged harshly. The barn smelled of hay and manure, the kitchen of bread, ash, and stew, streets of horses, soil, and rain. A human body was expected to carry its own scent, shaped by work, weather, and food. To smell of lavender or rose was unusual and usually meant wealth or religious ceremony. Ordinary people wore their scent like a shadow, unchosen but always present. And yet, despite this acceptance, there were quiet efforts to soften or sweeten the way one was perceived. Bundles of dried herbs, rosemary, sage, thyme, were tucked into sleeves or belts. Flowers were woven into hair. In some towns, sellers moved through markets, offering small cloth pouches filled with crushed petals or powdered resins. These could be pinned to clothing or carried in a pocket. The scent was faint, but it gave a sense of care, a personal touch in a world full of labor. Houses, too, held onto smells. The hearth infused everything with wood smoke. Clay floors absorbed years of meals and muddy feet. Thatched roofs held the scent of rain. In wealthier homes, rushes, dried grasses were spread across floors and changed with the seasons. Sometimes they were mixed with petals or sweet-smelling herbs. This didn't hide the smell of daily life, but it softened it, made it more bearable. People did not expect their homes to smell fresh, only to feel familiar. Churches and monasteries offered a different sensory world. Stone walls, high ceilings, and cool air gave them a sense of separation from daily grime. Incense burned during services, rich, resinous smoke that curled into the beams and settled into robes. The air was filled with chants and wax. Here, cleanliness was not about water, but about intention. One washed not just to refresh the body, but to prepare for something greater: prayer, communion, reflection. In this contrast between sacred and ordinary, people learned to manage their physical lives without shame. A dirty tunic could be forgiven if one's heart was clean. A soot-darkened hand meant work had been done. And when rest came, when the sun dipped low and silence filled the room, there was a comfort in knowing that even without daily baths, life moved forward with dignity, with care, and with quiet effort. Cleanliness, then, was a quiet practice. It lived in the folding of clean linen, in the brushing of boots before entering a church, in the soaking of tired feet at the end of a harvest day. It was present, always, but subtle, woven into life like the threads of a worn but well-loved garment. In the quiet glow of candlelight, as a family gathered near the hearth, the care of the body continued in small, deliberate gestures. A mother ran a cloth over her child's face. A father wiped his hands after a long day in the fields. These moments were not grand, but they mattered. They were a language of touch and care, repeated without thought, season after season. Children were taught cleanliness through habit, not lecture. They learned to shake out their bedding, to brush crumbs from wooden tables, to rinse their hands in the small basin set near the door. These daily tasks shaped their sense of what it meant to live with care. They did not bathe often, but they washed their hands before meals, wiped their mouths after eating, and cleaned their fingernails with quiet pride. In towns, tradesmen found their own rhythms of care. A cobbler would scrub his hands with sand after working with glue and dye. A tanner might rinse the strong smells of his trade with mint leaves crushed in water. Bakers dusted flour from their arms with stiff brushes. Though soap was rare and costly, other substances took its place. Ashes mixed with fat, crushed herbs, clay, and even wine or vinegar used in small amounts. These helped clean the skin when water alone was not enough. Monks and nuns followed their own routines. Within the walls of monasteries, cleanliness was tied to discipline and spiritual devotion. While full bathing was rare, washing the hands, face, and feet was common, especially before meals or prayers. Monks rose before dawn, and in the chill of early morning, they poured cold water from a basin over their hands in silence. It was not just a physical act, but a ritual, a pause that separated the sacred from the ordinary. In some monasteries, simple bath chambers still existed. They were small, stone-walled rooms, often built near kitchens where hot water was easier to carry. The monks bathed in shifts, quietly and modestly. These baths were not indulgences, but part of the rhythm of their service, like tending gardens, copying manuscripts, or feeding the poor. Cleanliness was seen as a form of respect for the body, which was considered a vessel for divine purpose. In noble courts, where luxury flowed more freely, the approach to hygiene was shaped by both custom and display. A visiting lord might be offered a scented cloth before a feast. A lady might apply rosewater behind her ears and at her wrists. Attendants prepared warm basins for their masters to wash before meeting guests or entering halls. Though these practices were not common among the peasantry, they created a sense of contrast, of elegance and order, meant to impress and soothe. Travelers faced unique challenges. On dusty roads between towns, rivers were rare, and inns were not always clean. A traveler might carry a small bundle of cloths soaked in vinegar or herbs to wipe sweat and dust from their face. Some wore gloves or wrapped their feet in dry leaves to avoid blisters and grime. Upon reaching a resting place, they might request a simple wash, a pitcher of water, a rough cloth, and a quiet corner. Even among the sick and dying, the body was treated with dignity. A person near death might have their face gently washed, their hair combed, their hands folded clean upon their chest. After death, women in the community would often prepare the body, washing it, dressing it, and wrapping it in linen. These acts, performed with reverence, reminded all who remained that care for the body did not end with breath. Cleanliness for medieval people was not measured in frequency but in intention. A single bowl of water, used carefully, could clean more than just skin. It could bring comfort, calm, and connection. A brush, a comb, a folded cloth. These were tools of respect, not vanity. In a world where life was often short and uncertain, these small acts offered a kind of steadiness, a quiet claim against chaos. And so, even when the baths were cold, and soap was scarce, and water came at a cost, people still found ways to care. Through gesture, through habit, and through quiet pride, they lived in bodies that worked, aged, and endured. And through those bodies they carried forward the simple hope that even in the darkest winters life could be kept clean, in spirit, if not always in skin. Night in the medieval world unfolded like a slow breath. As the last flames in the hearth gave way to embers and candles flickered into darkness, the body prepared for stillness. There were no evening showers, no scented soaps or warm baths to mark the transition to rest. Instead, there were quiet rituals, practiced more out of habit than luxury. A cloth dipped in cool water, passed gently across the face. Fingers combing through hair, loosening knots from a day spent beneath hoods or veils. Feet rinsed in shallow bowls, then wrapped in linen. Sleep came to people not as escape, but as necessity. Their bodies, shaped by labor and weather, carried the weight of each day's toil. Dirt remained beneath fingernails. The scent of earth or ash lingered on the skin, but none of this was seen as discomfort. It was normal, expected. What mattered more was warmth, a shared blanket, a well-stuffed mattress, the breath of animals in nearby stalls providing a soft, living heat that crept in through the walls. Bed linens were changed only when truly needed. They were beaten, aired, sometimes dusted with dried herbs or smoke to refresh them. Pillows were rare for most, but straw sacks or folded cloaks served their purpose. In noble homes, beds were grand, framed in carved wood, draped in thick curtains to keep out the draught. But even there, nightly routines remained modest. A gentle washing of the hands, perhaps a few drops of rose water on the wrists or neck, a comb set beside the bed. Cleanliness was not about starting fresh. It was about finding calm. Dreams, they believed, were shaped by the body's condition. To eat too heavily, to go to bed unwashed, or to sleep in disordered clothing was thought to cause troubled sleep. So people arranged themselves carefully. Tunics were loosened. Hair was braided. Belts and pins were set aside. In the stillness, the body settled into itself. Not perfectly clean, but cared for in the only way that mattered. In towns, the night smelled of stone, smoke, and slow-burning oil. In villages, it smelled of animals, hay, and the distant dampness of woods. People became part of that scent. They absorbed it, and in doing so, they felt rooted, grounded in the place they called home. There was no need to wash it away before sleep. The body belonged to the world it moved through. To wash it clean every day would have felt unnatural. Even in castles where servants tended to comfort, the nightly washing was small. A basin of warm water might be brought to a lady's room, and she would dip a cloth, pat her face, then her hands. A gentleman might sit silently while his man brushed dust from his boots and offered a towel for the neck and arms. There was a dignity in this simplicity. No scrubbing, no rushing, just the quiet undoing of a long day. Sleep itself was divided. Many woke in the middle of the night, what we might now call a first sleep and second sleep. Between these rests, people might pray, stoke the fire, tend to animals, or simply sit in silence.
This pause, this waking hour in the night, was not a disturbance. It was an accepted part of life, and often people would take this time to brush their hair again, or rinse their mouths, or rewrap their linens. The care of the body was ongoing, slow, steady, never complete. Cleanliness at night was not about perfection. It was about presence, feeling the cool water on one's fingers, smoothing the creases from one's clothes, settling into a space that felt safe. A person could go to bed with dirt on their feet and still feel whole, because they had prepared themselves with intention. They had made peace with their day. So the night held them, not in sterile comfort, but in honest rest. The body, weathered and real, folded into warmth, and the world, with all its scents and textures, breathed around them like a blanket. Morning arrived not with alarm bells or glowing screens, but with the slow shift of light through shutters and the distant crow of a rooster. Bodies stirred under wool and linen, warmed by shared breath and thick blankets. Before the chores began, before the lifting, grinding, chopping, and walking, there were small gestures of readiness. A splash of water on the face, the quiet binding of hair, fingers smoothing out wrinkles in clothing that had been slept in, worn thin, but still useful. Cleanliness in the morning was more gesture than transformation. There was no expectation to emerge fresh or fragrant, only to be prepared. In households with children, the mother might begin the day by wiping noses, dusting off cloaks, combing through tangles with a wooden comb. The water used was often cold, drawn from a well or rain barrel, and poured into a ceramic bowl. No one complained. It was simply what was done. For those who lived close to rivers or streams, there was sometimes a brief washing of arms or legs. A farmer might roll up his sleeves and splash water on his face, eyes squinting in the pale light. A washerwoman might rinse her hands and feet before walking into the chill of morning mist. The water was never wasted. It was used again, for animals, for cooking, for cleaning tools. Every drop had purpose. In monasteries, mornings were marked by bells. The monks rose in darkness, walking silently to the washroom. There, by candlelight, they rinsed their hands and faces in shallow basins. They washed as they prayed, fingers moving slowly, water falling gently. The cold water cleared the last asleep and prepared the body for prayer, study, and labor. Their movements were precise, unhurried. Even in cleanliness there was a rhythm, a reverence. Children learned these patterns early. A girl might be handed a cloth and shown how to wipe her face in small circles. A boy might be asked to fetch water, to hold still as his mother brushed crumbs from his sleeves. These were not acts of indulgence. They were signs of care, of order. To be clean was not to be polished, but to be ready, to show the world that one respected their place in it. Clothing itself played a role in how people felt clean. A fresh tunic, even if it had only been aired out and beaten free of dust, brought a sense of renewal. Underlayers of linen, which touched the skin, were changed more often than outer garments. These thin fabrics absorbed sweat and oils, and when laundered, perhaps once every few weeks, they carried with them the feel of comfort. Washing linen was hard work, done with ash soap, hot water, and stones, but the result was treasured. For those of higher status, the morning routine might include perfumes, not applied directly to the skin, but to gloves, handkerchiefs, or hair combs. Scented oils, stored in delicate glass bottles, were used sparingly. A noblewoman might dab her fingers and pass them through her hair. A nobleman might press a cloth to his neck. These scents were not meant to overpower,
only to suggest refinement, a whisper of wealth. Yet even among the poor there was dignity in mourning cleanliness. A shepherd might kneel by a stream to wash the dust from his face before tending to his flock. A mother might warm water over the fire to clean her baby's skin. A carpenter might pause before lifting his tools to brush the sawdust from yesterday off his sleeves. These moments were small, but they held meaning. To wash in the morning was to begin again, not as someone new, but as someone present. It was a reminder that the body, no matter how tired or calloused, was worth tending. That hands used to dig and sew and carry deserved cool water. That skin exposed to wind and sun and ash still longed for care. And so, the day would begin. Feet dry but firm in worn boots. Faces freshened, if only slightly. Eyes clearer than they were the night before. The medieval morning was not perfect, not polished, but it was honest. It welcomed the sun with a clean heart and a steady hand. The days in medieval Europe passed slowly, marked not by clocks, but by the position of the sun, the sound of bells, and the rhythm of work. And as the body moved through these long hours, plowing, weaving, tending, walking, it collected the world upon its skin. Dust settled in creases. Smoke wove itself into hair. The scent of labor clung to wool and linen. Yet none of this was unusual. It was simply the texture of life. Midday offered small chances for renewal. When the sun was high and work paused for food or rest, people would sometimes step aside to wash their hands, rinse their faces, or remove their shoes and rub their aching feet. A servant might pour water over the hands of their lord before a meal. A child might be told to wipe their nose and comb their hair before visiting a neighbor. These were quiet rituals, simple, thoughtful, woven into the fabric of daily living. The materials of cleanliness were humble: a basin, a cloth, a wooden comb, ash soap if one was lucky. But more often people relied on sand, salt, or vinegar to scrub and rinse. These tools, though crude by modern standards, served their purpose. A hand washed in vinegar water felt fresher. A face wiped with a damp cloth cooled in the wind. There was no expectation of being spotless. The goal was comfort, not perfection. In towns, the rhythm was faster. Markets bustled, and the smells of animals, baked bread, and human closeness filled the streets. Artisans, merchants, and apprentices moved constantly. And though few had access to true bathing, they still found ways to care for themselves. A cloth tucked into a belt, a pouch of dried herbs to mask odors, a moment stolen to rinse one's arms at a public fountain. Some towns had bathhouses, remnants of older traditions, where for a small fee people could bathe in heated water. These spaces were not private. They were social, shared, often gendered by time of day. People gathered not just to cleanse, but to speak, to rest, to breathe steam into tired lungs. The bathhouse was a kind of oasis, though it was not part of everyday life for most. Visits were occasional, perhaps monthly, or tied to holidays or special occasions. For the many who lived in villages or on the land, the stream, the barrel, or the rain served as the only source of cleansing. A wooden bucket left to catch the storm might be used for washing before supper. A small boy, muddy from the fields, might be scrubbed with cold water while standing barefoot on packed earth. There were no soaps with bright scents, no warm towels, just water, cloth, and care. Hygiene was also shaped by the seasons. In the colder months, water was hard to come by, and bathing was rare. Bodies were wrapped tightly in layers, and smells were hidden by herbs or simply ignored. But in spring and summer, when rivers thawed and warmth returned, people bathed more often. They stripped to their shifts and waded into shallow water, washing their skin with reeds and sand. Laughter echoed from river banks as children splashed and women rinsed cloths beneath trees. It was not glamorous, but it was real, and it was shared. Even those who did not bathe often still took care to change their undergarments when possible. Linen, worn close to the skin, was light and easier to wash than heavier garments. These inner layers absorbed sweat and dirt and could be laundered more frequently. A fresh shift or shirt made a person feel renewed, even if the rest of their clothing remained unchanged. Across the landscape, the body was understood not as something to be perfected, but to be maintained, respected, and endured. Dirt was inevitable. So was sweat. But so was care, gentle, habitual, and human. It wasn't how clean you were that mattered, but how you carried yourself through the day, with dignity, with intention, with enough self-respect to rinse your hands before eating and to brush the dust from your sleeves before greeting a neighbor. And so the day continued, filled with small, steady gestures of preservation. A life in motion, lived by bodies not ashamed of their effort, but mindful of their needs. By the time the sun began to lean westward and shadows stretched longer across the earth, the people of medieval Europe had already carried the weight of a full day. Shoulders ached, hands were sore, backs bent from hours of toil. But even in fatigue there remained a soft awareness of the body, how it felt, how it moved, and how it could be gently tended before night arrived again. Evening offered one final pause. After the animals were fed, after the tools were set aside and the meals eaten, people turned briefly inward. A splash of water, a brushing of dust from feet and hands. Sometimes this was done in silence. Other times it was shared, a mother wiping her child's cheeks, a husband rubbing his wife's feet beside the fire. These moments were not about cleanliness in the way we think of it now, but about care, a slowing down, a way of telling the body, you are still mine, you are still worthy of attention. Soap was rare in most homes. When available, it was harsh, made from ash and animal fat, gritty to the touch, with a scent more of work than of comfort. And so many did without. A cloth dipped in warm water could soothe tired skin. A handful of crushed mint or lavender rubbed into the palms could mask the sourness of sweat. These were small acts, but they held meaning. The body was not pampered, but it was not neglected either. Hair, long for women, and often shaggy for men, was combed with care. Wooden combs passed through strands slowly, untangling not just knots, but the fatigue of the day. It was common for families to share a single comb, and it might be warmed near the fire before use. A girl might sit at her grandmother's feet while her hair was braided for sleep, the fingers working slowly, rhythmically. This, too, was hygiene. Not the removal of all dirt, but the nurturing of a living thing. Feet, which bore the burden of movement across fields, stones, and muddy paths, received the simplest attention. A rinse in a small bowl, a cloth wiped between the toes, the removal of grit and straw. People did not expect their bodies to be untouched by labor, but they knew the value of preventing pain, of easing the parts that kept them standing. There was also a spiritual layer to all of this. For many, cleanliness was connected not only to comfort or health, but to the soul. Washing hands before prayer, rinsing the face before entering a church. It was believed that outward dirt could reflect inward disorder, and so even small acts of cleansing became gestures of humility, a way to prepare not just for sleep, but for peace. In some homes, herbs were burned in small pots to cleanse the air. Sage, rosemary, or dried flowers hung from beams. These scents drifted through the space, mingling with the warmth of bread or stew, softening the heaviness of a long day. They did not remove all odors, but they transformed them into something familiar, something lived in. Clothes, though not changed daily, were shaken out, brushed off, and folded with care. A tunic hung by the fire might dry the sweat of the day before. Cloaks were turned inside out, shaken, sometimes aired outdoors to release the must of wear. These garments were not many, but they were cherished, and to care for them, however simply, was a kind of hygiene all its own. In the quiet of twilight, with the world darkening beyond the door, the body softened. It let go of its tightness. Muscles eased, breath slowed. In that space between daylight and sleep, people made room for themselves again, not by scrubbing away the world, but by recognizing it, by acknowledging what the body had done, what it had survived, and offering it, if only briefly, a bit of tenderness. And so they readied themselves for rest. The washing was not perfect. The air still held the scent of labor, but the body was quieter now, more still. Not clean in the modern sense, but whole, real, cared for just enough to face another day.
Nightfall brought with it a different kind of silence, thicker, slower, and more complete than the quiet of early morning. In the flickering orange of hearthlight, people moved more carefully. Voices softened. The world outside grew colder and darker, and so the inside world, the body, the home, the space around the fire, became more precious. There were no hot baths waiting, no steaming showers to rinse away the day, but there was warmth in other forms. A damp cloth warmed near the fire, passed gently over the face. A bit of oil rubbed into cracked hands, feet wrapped in thick wool. These gestures were slow, deliberate. They didn't aim to erase the day's toil, only to ease it. People prepared themselves for sleep with the understanding that rest was not just for the mind, but for the body too. Hair was often loosely braided or tied with a strip of linen to keep it from tangling in the night. Those with long beards might tuck them into their collars or beneath a scarf. Layers of clothing were removed carefully, often only the outermost ones, and set aside for the morning. What remained closest to the skin was the softest, the most worn, the most familiar. The beds themselves were not luxuries, but they were sacred in their own way. A sack filled with straw, a wooden frame softened with cloth, a shared blanket passed from generation to generation. In colder seasons, people slept together, not just for warmth, but for comfort. The human body gave heat. It also gave rhythm, steady breath, the slow rise and fall of a chest beside you, the murmurs of someone drifting into sleep. Before lying down, many washed their hands, not because of germs, they did not know the word, but because of habit, of ritual, because a day's work ended with the washing away of its traces. A servant might rinse her hands in water saved from supper. A child might wipe his palms on a damp cloth handed to him by his mother. Even if the water was murky, even if it was reused, the act itself had meaning. In some homes, small bowls of scented water, infused with lavender, mint, or rose petals, were set by the bedside. These weren't common, and they weren't always fresh, but when they appeared, they offered a moment of softness. A hand dipped in cool water before sleep. A cloth laid gently over the forehead. The scent wasn't strong, just enough to suggest something peaceful. Illness was a constant presence in the medieval world, and so people learned to recognize the signs in the body. Soreness in the joints, a heaviness behind the eyes, the roughness of skin that hadn't been cleaned in days. Families would often turn to herbs, not just for medicine, but for cleansing, a warm infusion of thyme to soak a cloth in.
chamomile steeped and poured over aching limbs. These practices were passed down slowly by memory, by watching, by touch. Children, too, learned what it meant to care for the body, not in grand, transformative ways, but through small, repeated acts. Learning how to rinse one's feet, how to untie a knot without ripping cloth, how to hold still while a sibling wiped mud from behind the ears. Cleanliness was not about appearance. It was about readiness, about dignity, about stepping into rest with a body that had been, in some small way, respected. And so, in the quiet dark, people settled beneath their covers, wrapped not just in fabric, but in the comfort of having done enough. They had worked, walked, lifted, tended. They had eaten, spoken, listened. Their bodies were not spotless, but they were whole. They were carried gently into sleep by the simple rituals of care, performed with the tools they had in the time they could afford. There, in that stillness, under beams of wood and blankets of wool, cleanliness was not a state to be achieved. It was a rhythm to be lived, a way of being in the body, not perfect, but present. When dawn returned to the medieval world, it did so quietly. There were no alarms, no electric lights, no rush. The day unfolded with the rhythm of the sun, the crow of a rooster, or the soft stirrings of movement in a shared bed. Before the feet touched the cold earth floor, before the fires were stoked again, people were already slipping back into the body, aching, stiff, but still moving. There was no morning routine as we know it today, but even without sinks or mirrors, people had rituals. A splash of cold water from a bowl left out overnight, a comb passed through tangled hair, eyes wiped with the edge of a sleeve, teeth rubbed with a bit of cloth and salt, or cleaned with a twig if one was handy. There was no mint, no foam, just texture and intention, enough to feel awake, enough to feel ready. Water, so essential, was often gathered fresh at the start of the day. A child might be sent with a bucket to the nearby stream. A servant might draw water from a communal well. It wasn't only for drinking or cooking. It was for the body, too. To rinse the sleep from one's face, to clean a cut or sore, to dab behind the ears. These moments of contact, cool water against warm skin, were grounding, a way to return from the quiet of dreams to the work of the world. Clothing, too, played a role in morning renewal. The underlayers, close to the skin, might have been aired out or swapped for something slightly fresher. In homes with more means, these shifts and tunics were laundered in cycles. In poorer households, they were worn again and again, carefully maintained to stretch their life. The act of dressing, of wrapping the body again in familiar fabric, was itself a kind of cleansing. The body, though not scrubbed raw, was dressed with care, with respect. Children were often tended to first, their faces wiped, their hair braided or slicked back, their hands cleaned after breakfast. A mother might lift her baby and blow gently into the folds of its neck, checking for sourness or rash. A father might check his son's nails before sending him to the fields. Cleanliness wasn't about perfection. It was about readiness to be seen, to work, to be part of the day. Animals and humans lived closely, sometimes in the same building, separated only by wooden slats or low stone walls. Their smells were constant, and so people grew used to the scent of hay, wool, manure, and sweat. It was not something to be scrubbed away, but something to coexist with. Still, small efforts were made. Bundles of herbs hung in corners, rushes laid on floors to absorb moisture and mask odors, clothes beaten or shaken free of dust before stepping outside. In some towns and manors, more elaborate routines developed. Nobles or wealthier merchants might begin their days with warmed water and linen towels. A servant would pour water over their hands or brush their coats. A clean collar or fresh outer garment signaled status, yes, but it also carried a sense of personal pride. Not everyone could afford such attention, but many aspired to it, imitating it in simpler forms. The church bells would ring, and with them people would gather for morning prayers. Before entering, hands might be rinsed, hair straightened, cloaks shaken out. There was a spiritual cleanliness expected in sacred spaces, a sense that the body, while never pure, should be presented with dignity. Even among the poorest, this moment of care, a simple wash, a straighter posture, reflected a deep inner respect. These acts did not erase the grime of medieval life. They did not make the body glow or shimmer. But they reminded people that the body was not forgotten. It was a vessel for labor, for love, for prayer. It could be worn and tired and still be cherished. As the sun climbed higher and the work of the day began again, bodies moved into the world, carrying the faint freshness of water on the skin. The tightness of laces pulled, the scent of herbs or smoke still clinging to fabric. Cleanliness was not an end state. It was a thread running quietly through the fabric of life, tugged gently each morning, a promise to begin again. The workday in medieval Europe was not measured by clocks, but by the sky. As the sun climbed and the air warmed, the rhythm of labor quickened. Fields were tilled, bread was kneaded, animals were tended, and tools rang out against wood and stone. And through it all the body moved, sweating, bending, lifting. Dirt gathered beneath fingernails. Dust clung to skin. Fabric grew damp and heavy. Cleanliness was not something that could be maintained throughout the day. The labor itself undid it. A freshly washed face became streaked with soot. A combed head of hair fell forward in loose strands, damp with sweat. But people did not stop caring for their bodies just because they could not keep them pristine. They adapted. Midday brought a pause, brief but necessary. Meals were shared, often with bare hands. And so washing hands became a habit, not out of concern for invisible microbes, but from a desire for decency, for comfort. In towns, some homes had basins set near the door. In rural areas, a shared bowl of water might be passed around. The water wasn't always clean by modern standards, but it cooled the skin, rinsed away soil, reset the senses. Those who labored outdoors felt the day differently than those within stone walls. The sun scorched the skin. Rain soaked clothes and filled boots. Mud was a constant companion. To cope, people used what they had: leaves to wipe hands, river water to splash the face, a piece of cloth tied around the head to soak up sweat. These acts were not spoken about as hygiene. They were survival, a way to keep going. Within monasteries, cleanliness took on a more deliberate shape. Monks washed regularly, not in large tubs, but in quiet ritual. Hands before meals, feet before entering the chapel. Silence often accompanied these acts, as if to suggest that washing the body also cleared the mind. The body was not to be indulged, but neither was it to be ignored. It was a tool of devotion, deserving of care. In cities where people lived closer together and waste piled quickly, smells became part of the atmosphere. Yet even here, efforts were made. Barbers doubled as surgeons and bath attendants. Communal bathhouses existed, though their reputation shifted over time. And though access was uneven, the desire to feel clean, to be relieved of the weight of grime, was something nearly everyone shared. Some carried with them personal items to help: a small cloth, a sprig of herbs tucked into a sleeve, a little pot of ointment made from beeswax and lard, not for vanity, but for comfort.
to soften cracked hands, to ease the sting of wind-chapped skin, to wipe away the worst of the day before sitting down at table. For women, especially those managing both household labor and child-rearing, cleanliness meant something different. It was often less about the body and more about the space, keeping linens free of lice, boiling cloth when possible, rinsing cups and bowls. It was a quiet, ongoing war with the messiness of life, and through it all the body endured. A mother wiping her brow with her apron, a grandmother combing nits from her granddaughter's hair beneath the open sky. These were not grand rituals. They didn't leave the skin glowing or the breath scented, but they mattered. Because even in a world without soaps or scented oils, people found ways to acknowledge the body, to reset, however briefly, to remove just enough of the day's weight to continue. As afternoon deepened and the angle of sunlight grew sharper, the body felt the ache of repetition. And in that ache, there was memory of a cloth passed across the neck, a bowl of water lifted to the lips, a pause taken in the shade. Cleanliness in the medieval world was not a goal to be chased. It was a series of choices made quietly, again and again, with the tools at hand and the time available. The people of that world may not have bathed as we do, but they lived in their bodies with attention, with awareness, and with a kind of care born not of luxury, but of necessity and love. As the sun dipped lower and the shadow stretched long across the earth, the day began its quiet retreat. The sounds softened. Tools were set down. Doors creaked shut. Animals were led back into pens or stalls. People returned to their homes with dust on their clothes, sweat drying on their skin, and muscles aching from honest work. This time of day, just before nightfall, carried its own kind of ritual. Though water was precious, it was used carefully. Hands rinsed before touching food, faces splashed if water was near, the worst of the day's grime wiped away with a cloth that had already seen many days. These small acts were not intended to transform, only to soothe, a way to greet the evening with a little more softness. Some sat quietly by the fire, removing their shoes and rubbing their feet with worn palms. Children might help gather water or shake out the bedding. Elders would slowly comb out their hair, tugging gently through the tangles left by wind and time. The light from the hearth or a tallow candle didn't flatter the body, but it revealed the details. Calloused hands, cracked lips, reddened eyes. These signs were not hidden. They were accepted. In many homes, cloths were warmed by the fire to press against sore joints or chilled skin. It wasn't bathing in the modern sense, but it brought relief. Heat and touch worked together to quiet the body. In wealthier homes, oil infused with herbs might be rubbed into the scalp or massaged into the temples. Even among the poor, wild herbs were steeped and used to wash wounds or calm rashes. Thyme, sage, chamomile. They offered a form of cleanliness that had more to do with care than with purity. Clothing was rarely changed daily. Undergarments might be worn for several days or even weeks, depending on the season and what was available. But there was awareness of the body's changing needs. Garments were adjusted, belts loosened, hair retied or wrapped. The process of undressing or preparing for sleep was slow and practical. No mirrors, no rituals of vanity, just the thoughtful movement of hands, honoring the body they lived in. In monasteries and nunneries, the late hours were marked by prayer and silence. Monks would quietly wash their hands before Compline, the final service of the day. Their garments, simple and layered, held the scent of smoke and earth. There was little distinction between the sacred and the physical.
The act of washing was as much about humility as it was about hygiene, a way to acknowledge the body without elevating it. In cities, the streets outside were swept, though not always clean by today's standards. Waste was tossed from windows, but even so, efforts were made to keep doorways tidy. Ash was sometimes sprinkled on the floor to absorb spills. Herbs were hung to ward off smells. And in the alleys and corners, people still found ways to rinse their hands or freshen their skin. A tin bowl, a bit of rainwater collected in a cracked jug, it was enough. The concept of cleanliness was not binary. There was no perfect state to strive for. Instead, there was maintenance, a rhythm, a series of tasks repeated with patience. Wiping, combing, rinsing, shaking, scrubbing when possible. Cleanliness was felt rather than seen. It was in the lightness of limbs no longer stiff with mud, in the scent of herbs on fingers, in the coolness of water drying slowly from the nape of the neck. Families often cleaned their living space as the day closed. Straw was swept aside, a fresh layer laid down. Dust and ashes were pushed toward the door. These acts may seem unrelated to bathing, but they reflected the same desire, to live in a body and space that felt tended to, if only slightly. The skin might remain marked by labor, but the environment could be softened. As night returned and the world dimmed, the people of medieval Europe did not step into clean beds with clean bodies, but they stepped into rest with intention, with the dust of the day acknowledged, if not fully removed, with hands that had been used and rinsed, with faces that had felt water, even briefly. And in that quiet closing of the day, they affirmed something deeply human, that even without abundance, without soap or glass or perfume, the body could be honored. It could be soothed, recognized, and slowly guided into sleep, not perfect, but present, and enough. Sleep came differently in the medieval world. It was not something pursued with rituals of melatonin or glowing screens turned off at last. It came gradually, as the body surrendered to stillness, surrounded by the quiet of a world without electricity. The darkness was complete, deeper than anything most people today can imagine, and in that depth, the body rested, not clean in the modern sense, but tired, wrapped in wool or linen, and finally still. In many homes, sleep happened in shifts. The idea of one long, unbroken night's sleep was not the norm. People often drifted off early, then woke again for a time in the middle of the night. Some prayed, some talked softly with their family, some simply lay quietly, watching the fire dim or listening to the night sounds outside. Then sleep returned. This first sleep and second sleep reflected the rhythms of a world tuned to firelight and seasons. Even in this fragmented rest, there was peace. The body, though covered in the dust of the day, found a kind of release. There was no expectation to feel refreshed, only to feel safe enough to let go for a while. And when the cold crept in through the stone walls or under the wooden door, blankets were pulled tighter. When lice itched or joints ached, the discomfort was endured, not out of strength, but necessity. Lice and fleas were part of life. Even among the well-off, they were a familiar nuisance. People dealt with them as best they could, combing, shaking out bedding, applying herbal mixtures made of rosemary, wormwood, or mint. Linen shirts were sometimes left out in the frost, the cold said to kill what heat couldn't. But no one expected to be free of pests entirely. The body was not a pristine vessel. It was a place of constant negotiation with the world around it. And yet, there were moments of comfort, even beauty. The warmth of another body close by, the softness of worn cloth against skin, the scent of dried lavender tucked into bedding. These small touches made a difference. They reminded people that care was possible, even in hardship, that the body could be tended without needing to be perfected. In the countryside, homes were often one room. Families shared sleeping spaces with each other, and sometimes even with animals. Privacy was a rare luxury. But so was loneliness. The sounds of breathing, of shifting limbs, of soft murmurs in sleep, all of it became part of the night's texture. And in those shared silences, there was a kind of safety, a quiet thread of connection. For those who lived in castles or monasteries, night brought different sounds. The wind through stone corridors, the creak of wooden beams, the occasional bell marking the hours. Still, even surrounded by cold walls, people wrapped themselves tightly in layers curled toward the warmth of the hearth or the memory of sunlight. The darkness was not feared, only accepted. And within it, the body slowed. Dreams came in their own way, sometimes vivid, shaped by stories heard by the fire or prayers whispered at dusk. A peasant might dream of clean water flowing freely. A monk might dream of glowing light or saintly voices. A child might dream of summer fields, barefoot and running. Whatever came, it was welcomed. There was no analysis, no interpretation, only the dream and the warmth of stillness. When people woke in the night, they did not panic. The break between sleeps was not a flaw, but a pause. Time to sit up, to speak softly, to tend the fire, to wrap a child in another layer of cloth. Then, just as gently, they would lie back down, and with that return came a second descent, deeper, quieter, softer. The breath slowed again. The aches faded once more, and sleep reclaimed what the day had left undone. Cleanliness in all this was never the goal. Rest was restoration. The quiet acceptance that the body, no matter how marked by labor or untouched by soap, was worthy of stillness. That it could be cradled by sleep, warmed by presence, calmed by the simple fact of having made it through the day. And so, beneath woolen blankets, atop straw or wood, the people of medieval Europe let themselves drift, not polished, not pure, but whole in their weariness, touched by water, by herbs, by care, and finally by silence. The morning returned without fanfare. No alarms, no glowing screens, only the slow shift of light through a wooden shutter, the distant crow of a rooster, or the soft stirring of another body nearby. People woke not all at once, but gradually, stretching limbs stiff from sleep, rubbing eyes crusted with ash and dreams. The world returned in quiet layers. The same clothes from yesterday were pulled back on, still carrying the weight and scent of the day before. A woolen tunic that had softened with age, a linen shift that had seen many washes and many more days without. There was no expectation of freshness. The morning was not about renewal. It was about readiness. Water, if available, was used sparingly. A cold splash to the face, a rinse of the mouth if time allowed. In some homes, a cloth soaked in yesterday's boiled water was used to wipe the eyes or clean around the neck. The gesture was small, but it woke the senses. It was enough. The hearth, now just glowing embers, was coaxed back to life. Heat returned to the room in slow waves. Meals were prepared, simple, warm, often porridge or bread with broth. Hands were washed again, not with soap, but with water from a basin shared among the family. It didn't purify, it softened, it welcomed the new day. In wealthier households, servants might bring warm water to the rooms of their lords. Copper pitchers were poured into ceramic bowls. Scented herbs could be added if available. Rose petals, sage, or lavender. Towels, rough by today's standards, were offered. But still there was no expectation of full bathing. It was about refreshment, dignity. a quiet kind of cleanliness. Children were tended with simple care, hair combed through with wooden combs, often painfully if knots had formed, faces wiped with the edge of a damp cloth, smiles encouraged with honeyed words or a bit of sweetness if any could be spared. Their clothes were passed down, mended, reused again and again, but clean hands and tidy braids still marked a kind of pride. Even in poverty, people cared how they were seen. By neighbors, by the church, by one another. Animals were fed, stalls cleaned, tools were inspected. And slowly the day took shape. The body moved from rest into action, carrying with it the residue of sleep and the beginnings of new labor. Whatever dirt had not been scrubbed away the night before would soon be joined by fresh dust, sweat, and ash. The cycle never ended. But within that cycle, there was intention. Each gesture, no matter how small, held meaning. In monasteries, the bell marked the start of morning prayer. Before entering the chapel, monks would cleanse their hands and faces with cold water, drawing deep, silent breaths as they did. The water stung in winter and refreshed in summer. It was not a luxury. It was a duty, an act of respect for the body and for the sacred space they were about to enter. In cities, the sounds of carts and footsteps began to echo through narrow streets. Vendors set up stalls, doors opened. People emerged, hair tucked beneath linen caps, faces set with the expression of another day ahead. They carried with them the scent of smoke, the weight of worn clothing, and the quiet hope that the day would bring enough warmth, enough food, enough rest when it ended. Those who had access to bathhouses might plan their visit for later in the week, a rare opportunity to strip down, soak in warmth, and leave behind layers of physical exhaustion. But even this was temporary. Soon, the dirt would return, the sweat, the work. So they cherished those moments not because they transformed them, but because they reminded them they were human. The medieval morning did not promise clarity or energy. It promised repetition. But in that repetition, people found their own rituals of comfort. A splash of cold water, a spoonful of warm broth, a moment of quiet before the tasks began. Cleanliness remained a pursuit of balance, not perfection. No one expected to shine. They simply wanted to feel slightly lighter than they had the night before, to smell of herbs instead of waste, to move through the world without shame. And in these moments, as the sun stretched higher and the breath of the new day moved through open doors and smoke-filled chimneys, the people of medieval Europe carried on, not spotless, not untouched, but resilient, bearing the earth on their skin and the rhythm of life in their bones.
Midday brought with it a brief pause, a sliver of time when the body slowed, when work halted just long enough for bread to be shared, for water to be poured, for tired backs to rest against cool stone walls. It was in this pause, more than any soap or bath, that people found a moment of relief. The sun was higher now, casting sharper shadows, warming skin that had gone cold at dawn. Hands stained by soil or soot were rinsed in shared basins or nearby streams. The act was not ceremonial, but practical. Water trickled over fingers, muddy at first, then clearer, leaving behind the rough outlines of nails and calluses, revealing only enough to continue the day. The cloth used to dry them was never white, but it was worn soft from repetition, from care. In town squares, artisans wiped their arms before meals, brushing away the powder of stone or flecks of molten metal. Children playing in the dust were called in, their faces hastily wiped with a wet edge of a sleeve before they were handed a crust of bread or a bowl of warm stew. Cleanliness,
if it meant anything at all, meant readiness for food, for communion with others. Among shepherds and farmers, meals were taken outdoors. Feet were dusty, legs scratched by thorns. And still they sat together beneath trees or near stone fences, passing bowls between them, wiping mouths with the backs of their hands. The sun, the breeze, the slow chewing of food, all of it felt like a kind of cleansing, not of the skin, but of the spirit. Within cloisters and castles, the rituals of midday were more structured. Servants would wash before serving, dipping their hands in warm basins, drying them with cloths embroidered with the family crest. Monks would wash before meals in silence, water catching the light in stone basins worn smooth by years of quiet use. But even here the purpose was not vanity. It was humility, an acknowledgment of the day's labor, of the body's wear. Soap, when it was used, came in hard, grayish blocks, often made from animal fat mixed with ashes or lye. It was scratchy, rough on the skin, but effective. Reserved for deeper cleaning, laundry, perhaps, or a rare full-body wash. It was not part of most people's daily habits. Instead, people relied on ashes to scrub, on coarse cloths to scrape, on herbs to mask scent. Lavender, rosemary, and marjoram were tucked into belts or sewn into sleeves, not because they masked all odors, but because they made the air more bearable, more human. Those with more means might crush petals into their hair or dab rosewater behind their ears, but most simply carried the scent of smoke and effort and age, softened at best by the whisper of crushed mint leaves in a pocket. There were moments when full washing became necessary, after childbirth, after caring for the sick, after death. These were not moments of luxury, but of duty. Women would heat water over fire, pour it into wooden tubs, add herbs if they had them, and tend to each other with steady hands. Cloths were soaked, skin was rubbed, bodies were wrapped in clean linens. The work was slow, sacred in its way, and for the sick washing was both care and farewell. Fevered brows wiped, hands held in warm water, faces cleaned gently with lavender cloths, as if to soothe what could not be healed. Cleanliness here became something far greater than hygiene. It became comfort. It became love. As the sun dipped toward late afternoon, the dirt of the day gathered once again beneath nails and in the folds of skin. Dust clung to sweat-damp hair. But still, people moved forward. Clean or not, they worked, they spoke, they sang. The body, after all, was not a thing to be perfected. It was a vessel for labor, for kindness, for enduring. So they folded their cloths, stacked their bowls, and rose once again to meet the remainder of the day. Not purified, not refreshed in the way modern minds might imagine, but grounded, reconnected to the earth, and reminded, in the simplest of ways, that even without showers or soap, there was always the chance to be seen, to be cared for, to continue. Evening returned slowly in the medieval world. The sky darkened not in an instant, but by degrees, blue fading to gray, gray giving way to the soft hush of twilight. Fires were stoked once more, meals simmered, and the same hands that had tilled soil, kneaded dough, or tended animals moved gently now, winding down the rhythm of the day. This was not a time of personal grooming or self-care as we know it. It was a time for quiet, for wrapping oneself in what warmth could be found, for brushing away the loose dirt of the day with a cloth or a corner of linen, for soothing the body through stillness rather than scrubbing. Fatigue became its own kind of cleanser, washing away the urgency of the day and making space for stillness. In homes, families gathered around fires, small ones, cautious with wood. The smoke that had followed them throughout the day now curled upward inside the walls, clinging to beams and clothing, weaving into hair and blankets. This scent was not unpleasant. It was familiar. It meant safety. It meant another day had passed, and the body had made it through. Children, their faces smudged and hands rough from play, were tucked beneath woolen layers. Parents wiped noses, combed fingers gently through tangled hair, hummed lullabies handed down over generations. Baths were not offered before bed, nor expected. A cloth, damp from the day's last pot of water, might be used to clean a chin or dab away tears. The rest, sweat, dust, soil, was left until a more convenient time, or simply endured. In monasteries, the day ended in silence. Kumplin, the final prayer, offered monks a time to reflect. They moved through stone corridors with steady steps, their robes whispering along the floors. Some would wash their hands again, not out of necessity, but reverence. The act was as spiritual as it was physical, a final gesture of surrender before rest. In castles, nobles retired to chambers with heavy drapes and flickering candles. Servants might bring basins of water, warm cloths to wipe the face or feet. Hair was braided loosely, rings removed. But even here the act of fully washing was reserved, ritualized, not routine. The day ended with the same layer of the world upon the skin that had been carried since morning, softened only by time, not by soap. Bodies, far from sterile, were treated with practical care. They were strong, weathered, capable. They were not pampered, but neither were they neglected. In a world where death could come from a cold wind or spoiled bread, the simple act of surviving the day was enough. To eat, to rest, to feel warmth, to be seen. The myths of medieval filth, of people who never bathed, who wallowed in waste, oversimplify what was in truth a careful balance between scarcity, belief, and endurance. Cleanliness, though not constant, was not absent. It lived in small acts. A cloth wiped across a brow, herbs rubbed into the scalp, linen changed after weeks of wear. It was not perfection. It was persistence. The medieval body did not glisten, but it endured. It bore the marks of work and time and faith. It carried disease, yes, but also laughter, affection, and memory. It was not fragile. It was part of the world, not apart from it. And so, as the stars appeared in skies unclouded by modern light, as homes quieted, as the last embers were left to smolder, the people of medieval Europe folded into sleep, not because their bodies were purified, but because they were tired, because they had done enough. They dreamed beneath the same moon, their skin marked with the earth, their breath slow and steady. No soap, no steam, no polished mirrors. Just the human body, wrapped in linen, warmed by closeness, and trusted to carry them into another dawn.